every year, I'm Roland Pease. I broadcast with the BBC, but I live very locally. And every year I put on a few of these little conversations for the Science Festival. And if we go to the first, if we go to the slide set, I actually had something completely different planned. and then this was happening locally at the end of November. And Storm Bird came in, and it just caused consternation all around. With here you have on the right Tenbury, which was the middle of it was flooded by, I don't even know the river, is it the Severn? It's the Severn. I think that's Chippenham just there was flooded in the middle. And it was the second time Tenbury had been flooded in the past 2 years or 3 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. And people are saying, hang on, how long can we go on living here if the rain just keeps on coming on? And flooding is this enormously destructive force, disruptive to people's lives, expensive. And people were saying, why? Why is it happening? Why can't we deal with it better? Why can't we know in advance what's going on? So I've brought together, I'm so grateful, 3 experts from the University of Reading. Hannah, I'll call you the muse on floods current, present. Hannah Cloke, she's a professor of hydrology. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thomas Kjeldsen is at Bath University. He's an engineer, so he knows all about where to build the dams. If anyone's been so far into the main hall, there's a lovely little thing that Reading University have brought along, which is where you can play with dams and try and stop London getting flooded, or make sure it does. Yeah. And here, Lizzie Kendon is from the Met Office, where she is in charge of the future. So no pressure there. Pressure. She's come all the way from Exeter. I'm immensely grateful that she's done that to come and talk to us. So we will talk about the various pressures in the next half hour, 40 minutes or so. I'm looking at the audience. I'm not sure this is going to go down so well. Is there any listener do people here listen to the Archers?
Oh, there's a couple.
Right. Oh. How upset have you been in the past 2 weeks? Because you can blame Hannah. Explain how you got involved with the Archers, Hannah.
Yeah, so I work a lot advising the entertainment industry on various things, and I did go up and talk to the Archers team to tell them about all of the different types of flooding that they might experience in Ambridge, which is the place where this play is undertaken every single day, isn't it? Every single day. And so it's a fake place, but they'd had a big flood in the past, like a normal flood in the river, but we were talking about sewage flooding. So when the sewage comes out of the sewers and it gets into people's homes, and people have no idea it's going to happen, and just how very disgusting and dramatic and awful how that is. So yeah, it was my fault that they ran with that storyline, and lots of people were complaining. They were in the middle of making their dinner while they were listening.
Yeah, I saw lots of that. Out of interest, did they contact you before Storm Bird or after?
Before, actually, yeah.
Right.
So yeah, but of course we have flooding all of the time, and this is an ongoing issue. This is based on real life stories of people's homes being flooded by sewage, and the reality of that, and that you are out of your home for more than a year sometimes, just trying to recover from this really terrible event.
So I think for me, I'd like you all to take this up, but for me the big point is that flooding is not just about rain. It's about rain and landscape and what we put in the way of that. I don't know, if you start off with that, Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, most people think, it rains, then it's going to flood. That's absolutely simple, but it isn't that simple, definitely. Sometimes it's where people are. So we tend to now live in very dangerous places, and they're becoming more dangerous as the climate changes, of course. But we've changed the landscape as well. So we've paved over everything, particularly around Swindon. You can see lots of houses going up everywhere all the time, and of course that means that rain can't soak in to the land anymore, and we've changed the way our rivers flow. A lot of the time we've canalised them and made them full of concrete, and so they can't spread out onto their floodplain, and we can't store that water in the land anymore. So that's making floods, we're changing it all the time, and the climate's changing, and so that's making floods worse.
Thomas, I was talking to you just before about Bath, which is on the... I mean, people like to live on the river, partly because in the past it was an absolutely vital resource, I guess. But also, it's an attractive place to live.
Yeah.
Bath, go on.
Yeah, well, funny enough, most houses in Bath actually turn away from the river.
Oh.
Most of the historical buildings, there's one or two that actually, everything else faces away. So I think that's an indication that it probably wasn't so pleasant when Bath got built in the...
A bit of archers going on down the river.
Yeah, it's a convenient place to throw things in.
Yeah.
And so, so most of the Georgian stuff doesn't actually engage with the river very much. There are bits of the city that's populated by the traditionally working class neighbourhoods that did get flooded.
Right.
Quite a bit.
But its very setting is in the bottom of a deep valley.
Yeah, yes, it does.
I mean,
it is. There isn't much place for it to go. That is true. But the bits that always got flooded were the poor bits of town. And for many years they decided, we need to do something about this.
When was it last flooded?
1960. 1960 was the event that... So prior to 1960, it got flooded lots and lots of times. And every time they sort of thought about what to do, and lots of famous engineers came up with designs for the city, and so, but always too expensive. So it just paid off. It compensated the people who were flooded until 1960, when I guess morals and ethics had moved too far. The city decided to do something.
So what was the... How were they successful?
Well, they had lots of different schemes. So one of them was we could dig a big hole up in Wiltshire and just capture all the water before it gets there.
Right.
That turned out to be impractical and expensive. We could build some very high levees dams inside the city, but that's unsightly. We could build a big bypass channel. It takes the water out, but that's also expensive. Or we could remove some of the bridges and dig out the sediment in the river and make it sort of a bit more hydraulic efficient and send it down towards Bristol. And then
so that's someone else's problem then?
Yeah.
So, okay.
And so you can try to guess which of the four options. So that's what they did. So there used to be some beautiful old sort of arch bridges in the centre of Bath, but figured out that they were the sort of stumbling blocks. So they got taken out.
They were sort of dams, basically, effectively.
They turned into dams because there was all sorts of debris, trees, cows, whatever comes down the river and the flood blocks the archways, and suddenly the centre of Bath was underwater. So they got taken. So if you go to Bath today, you'll see some sort of very efficient slabs of concrete across the River Avon to prevent that from... There's metal
ugly.
Sheeting along the sides. Just
They're
to make
ugly?
Sorry?
They're ugly. Certainly the one near the railway station is this horrible sort of slab of concrete. But
Yeah, but the
as
city
an engineer, you think, whoa, that's...
It's a very efficient. But the city doesn't get flooded in the same way as it did back then. So the way the city looks in the centre is a sort of testament to the fight with flooding over the past 200 years. So.
I mean, so you've been doing a big study of the south, of the Avon area, Bristol, and all around there. So you're looking at the vulnerability.
Yes.
Well, I don't know what the history is even, but I don't know if you can...
So what we've been trying to do is basically try and explore how flood risk might be changing in this local area. So we've been taking basically the weather forecast model, as we're all familiar with from the television, and running that like a 100-year forecast. So we run it out for 100 years, and we run it 12 times over, and we're using the information from that to essentially feed into a flood model to understand how flooding might change. So traditionally within sort of flood management processes, what we do typically is just add sort of an increase from climate change. So climate change is going to increase rainfall by 20%, and they just add that on, and then they run it through the flood model. The problem is, as you can probably imagine, changes in rainfall are so complicated. So it's not just intensity increases. So the rate of rainfall doesn't just increase. Changes in frequency of rainfall, changes in clustering of events, changes in spatial patterns of rainfall. And these can all combine together to affect exactly how the flooding might respond. So we've been trying to basically do the best study we can with the latest modelling capabilities that we have to give us new understanding of how flood levels might change in Bristol, Bath and local areas.
I mean, one of the things about floods for me is that they tend to be incredibly localised. I think it's this community or that community. And Bristol, you have, I think, is it 5 rivers?
So I guess the first thing to say is there's 3 types of flooding.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've been muddling up a bit here, but we've got pluvial flooding where there's very heavy rainfall and you get surface water build up, and that's obviously the sort of places that are vulnerable to our cities, but also very small confined catchments. Then you've got fluvial flooding where you've got rivers overtopping their banks, and then of course we've got coastal flooding as well. And all of those 3 components actually are likely to get worse with climate change. So we expect the rainfall to be a lot more intense, and we can talk about that if you want. We expect that to impact river discharge, so the amount of rainfall going, the rate of water down the river, those sort of patterns will affect particular areas. So, low-lying areas are vulnerable to river flooding, but surface water flooding could be anywhere. People can get surface water flooding at the top of a hill because it just happens to be at the local position where there's a very high concentration of water. So it can be surprising where you can get these local hotspots of risk. And obviously coastal areas are very vulnerable to rising sea levels and storm surges coming in.
And presumably, the famous, is it 53 floods of the East Coast? That was a combination, or was it mostly just the storm surge coming in, or was there rain at the same time as the tide was all wrong?
So that's one of the things we're really worried about in the future. So where you get all these 3 elements combining together, and there hasn't actually been that much work done on it to really understand, how important is it for us to capture all of these 3 components. But exactly, you're absolutely right. There's many cases where we've had really severe flooding where it's been a combination of maybe coastal and rain or river and heavy rainfall.
I presume Tenbury was a mixture of pluvial, as you were saying, and fluvial, the river stuff. It had already rained on top of them, and then the river banks brought water from upstream.
That's right. So and there's obviously sometimes a lag in these systems because the river takes a little while to respond. It depends on the catchment. Some catchments are quite flashy, which means the rain falls and quite quickly they rise. But you can have others where there can be some delay. I know talking to hydrologists, Hannah's one, but the Thames, it can be months between the rain falling and it actually reaching the river. So different catchments have very different response times.
That makes it difficult to... one of the complaints about what happened in Storm Bert was people saying we weren't given enough warning. I'd like to say, I know that you don't do the daily forecast, but the fact, I think, that probably had days more expectation of heavy rain in this part of the country than we would have had 2 decades ago. I don't know how to...
Yeah, absolutely. The weather forecasts have got better, right? They're much better than they were. So we do have sometimes a week ahead. We can see that some heavy rainfall is coming towards us, and therefore we have some kind of understanding of whether it's going to flood or not. The key thing is trying to work out exactly when and where that's going to happen, and there's huge uncertainty in this. And as you know, you get to kind of 1 day ahead, it becomes slightly more certain, but in certain types of weather condition, you still can't really tell. So it's really difficult to issue those flood warnings in time, or even those heavy rain alerts in time. So we are better, and we're getting better all the time, but better understanding of the physics of the atmosphere, better supercomputers as well, they're really important to make this happen. But it's still a really difficult job.
And who is there someone who takes the weather forecast and then looks at the rivers and the soil, or is that the stuff that the Met Office does, or how does that last link in the chain if it's a combination
that's a good question. Yeah, so we have flood forecasting models in this country are run by the Environment Agency. And they work together very closely with the Met Office. So there's a team who look at both the weather and the flooding at the same time, which is really encouraging, isn't it, that they're talking to each other. And then we have local models that will try and predict exactly in the middle of a town, when that place is going to flood. And that last bit is very tricky. And some of the things that went wrong in Storm Bert, we didn't quite have those trigger levels right in these computer models that were being run. And it's really difficult. And that trigger level is, this house is going to flood. when the river gets this high. And getting that exactly right is really difficult because we keep changing the landscape. So the last time it flooded, it might have behaved slightly differently. So you have to keep on top of these things all the time, and it's a really difficult job. But of course, if your house gets flooded, you don't really care. You just want somebody to tell you the right information at the right time. So yeah, very frustrating.
But that's incredibly, well, it is because, if you're living in Tenbury or in Chippenham and the river can come up, 50 centimetres and it's no problem. It comes up 52 centimetres, it starts tipping over, and there's just a sort of infinite amount of water coming down there. And as the homeowner or the shop owner, how are you supposed to make the decisions? It's
yeah, and so having that forecast that something might happen is the trigger for you to take some action to try and protect your house. That's really how it should work in theory. You have a yellow alert perhaps of heavy rainfall, and that means, start to take action. Perhaps you can protect your house with a floodgate. Perhaps you can start moving your possessions, for example, your precious photos. For those of you who've been listening to the Archers, move them, move them away from the ground floor. But that's very difficult. People don't really understand how to use those forecasts sometimes, and I think we have a lot of work to do there.
Yeah. I mean, we're moving into a situation now where we try to issue, warnings. So we don't just say, rainfall. We actually provide information on the likely impact. So it's both for the likelihood and the impact. So you're actually communicating people directly, what is the risk of flooding as opposed to there's going to be heavy rainfall, so that we try and translate it into something that is then meaningful for people, and then eventually that provides the information you need to how to act, I guess.
I mean, in a sense, it seems to me that I've heard people complaining about scaremongering when we get the yellow and orange and red warnings, and why are you doing this now? You never used to. And I presume part of it is you couldn't in the past. You couldn't give any kind of sensible warning, I suspect, 20 years ago in the way that you can now.
So the forecast capabilities are increasing all the time, and they're a lot better now. I mean, we have recently introduced this alert system because we're conscious that the messaging going out is critically important. So we want to be able to provide information to people. So we're going beyond just the meteorological hazard, so the weather hazard, to actually impacts on the ground. So we're developing the capabilities.
So, Thomas, what about the infrastructure side of this? So you can remove a bridge, and that's a permanent change to the system. What can be done reactively, let's say upstream, or?
I think that's one of the things that so you can warn about these big rivers and so. But lots of this takes place at where your local authority will have the responsibility of the small river. They're managing lots of culverts and local infrastructure that's
culverts.
Culverts is a critical issue, and stuff happens during flood events. It's a dramatic event. Lots of things come flowing down, get passed in, gets blocked off. So it
sounds so small, the idea that, so you're saying that a culvert that's not carrying away water could make the difference?
This happens quite a lot. This is a big issue for our local authorities. Probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of these structures around our cities, and they get blocked off or can get blocked off, and if they don't get attended to in time, then even if you thought nothing was going to happen, it can happen, but you'll be effectively building little dams all around. So the local authority spends a lot of money driving around, cleaning up.
But they can't do that the day before. Or maybe they should, I don't know.
I think they should, yeah. I think they would like to, because I don't think, as a crew member, you would like to be, by the time it's flooding, you have to get into this river with all the stuff that's coming down. It's a real health and safety issue for them. So if they get a prior warning that this can happen, you ought to tidy up.
I mean, I was expecting you to say that, we have a small structure upstream of Bath that we can just raise a little dam and we can flood some sad village or some fields or something.
No, I don't think we do, and I don't think we would want to, and I think that's the sort of thing that would probably trigger quite a lot of conflict. Where this is not unusual that the people managing the environment agencies get accused of sacrificing one village in favour of another. So much so that my first job was to make a plan for a flood warning system, and with the Environment Agency. And when we drove out, the Environment Agency, he stopped and took his vest off before we drove into the town, because they don't like us much in here. They thought we were sacrificed. Well, really, it was
So you just
the defences that failed.
So then it sounds to me like the challenge, well, for all of you, but maybe for Lizzie and you, in terms of getting our river infrastructure and everything right before the rainfall increases that's pretty important.
I mean, I guess it's interesting hearing what you're saying there. I think one of the real concerns, I guess, moving forward is that things are going to be different in future. So the past isn't a good indication of what's to come. We expect changes in seasonal rainfall patterns. So, blocking of drains and things is, we expect much more rainfall in autumn when all the leaves are on the line. So some of these issues that we're going to have in the future will be much worse because of combinations of factors, not just the fact that there's more heavy rainfall, but it may fall in the time when there's leaves on the trees ready to block drains. You might have whole sequences of storms so that the catchment's already very wet. These are the sort of things that can be really important, and I guess it make it even more challenging for trying to manage infrastructure.
Yeah.
Because we've had, is it a record wet 18 months now, or what?
So, well, last winter was the wettest on record. So for the UK, we have got incredibly good national records. So we have records right back to the 1830s. So that's 100 years, and then another 100 years. So just think how long those records have been running, and we're very unique. One of the unique abilities to look at this. So what it means is we can look at how the climate has been changing over such a long period of time, and you can really see it's a lot wetter. So for example, since 2000, so this century, in all that time, over all those records, if we pick the 10 wettest years, say, over all that whole 100 periods, 5 of them have happened since 2000 and none of the driest. So that just shows how, just a basic statistic like that, and of the wettest winter ever, it happened last year. And the wettest day that we've ever had for the UK was in October 2020, when we had as much rain to fill Loch Ness. So in one day across the UK, more rain fell than could have filled Loch Ness. So that just puts in perspective how dramatic these changes are that we're seeing now in the observations. So there's no, question about uncertainty. We are actually seeing these changes now.
I mean, to me, it's counterintuitive. Hotter, you expect global warming means hotter, and I think hot is dry, but...
Well, so yeah, interesting. Exactly what my children said to me on the train. So in summer, we expect it to be hotter and drier overall, but that doesn't mean there's less flood risk, because a hotter atmosphere can hold more water. And that's the fundamental driver of changes in rainfall for the UK, in fact, for the globe. So, whether or not there is more rainfall depends on where you are. And obviously in the UK, we're right next to the sea. So we've got a very maritime continent. So there's a huge, vast ocean of water just on the doorstep. And weather systems coming in, we've got one of the most variable weather in the whole of the world because of where we're situated.
Hasn't felt like it for the past 6 months.
Well, no, but all this water can evaporate from the sea into the air and come in and hit us. So, in the summer we expect it to be hotter and drier, but when it does rain, it'll be a lot more intense. And in the winter, we expect it just to be wetter overall. So there's a seasonal difference, but overall, warmer means more moisture for us here in the UK.
So actually, go on, Thomas.
This is bad news.
It's very bad.
Well, it's the intensity. I was going to say it's one thing. If I could design a weather system, it would rain every night just a little bit and keep my garden happy, and then the day would be nice. But that's not. I suspect there's some statistic that half the rain falls on 20 days of a year or something like that. But
so. I don't know off the top of my head. I know the average for the UK is we have about 1 metre of rainfall a year, roughly. And we're expecting, so for every degree we warm regionally, we expect a 5 to 15% increase in the rainfall, intensity of rainfall, depending on where you are. So 5% in London, 15% in Scotland, just because of the difference across the climate. So for every degree of warming, so whatever pathway we take, that is what we expect. And just to say, last year was the warmest year on record globally. And we were 1.5 degrees C for the first time ever above the previous And that is important because that is the Paris target. That's the target that we've signed up to avoid dangerous climate change. And last year we missed it. We went over it for the very first time. Now, whether we stay over it is the question. Okay. So, but for every degree of regional warming, we expect a 5 to 15% increase in the intensity of rainfall here in the UK.
One of the things I try to grapple with is this idea of 15%, is that a big deal? But it comes back, does it, to this idea that you just go past a critical threshold for the infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. And then if you're only 2 centimetres off now, then anything you do in the future is going to be worse. And we're actually making the landscape worse too, right? So we're building over everything at the same time. So we're compounding all these problems as well. So it's like this problem, but multiplied. So we're really storing up a lot of problems for the future.
I mean, where we're sat right now, this is, I mean, some people know this area better than I do, but they've built sort of pseudo canals and ponds and things. And a few years ago, they put in this enormous drainage pipe, which went somewhere towards the railway station. I don't know if anyone knows where it went. I mean, these are the right things to do. Are they adequate? How do you even? Because it's expensive. The more infrastructure you put in, the more expensive it is.
Yeah, but if you make space for the water, then that's key. So where you do have areas that can flood seasonally or can hold on to those really heavy rainfalls that you get in the summer, then that's what you want to do. You want to have these temporary spaces in the landscape that can fill up and then go down again. So a lot of these structures you see, and a lot of these developments we've seen here do have some of those spaces around. So that's encouraging.
Is it, Thomas?
Yes, I think on a very local scale, yes, of course it is. You're managing the runoff on a local scale. But just go back to Bath, because it's the example I know the best. We have new developments near the city now, and are very concerned about building trees to reduce flood risk and so. But by the time the water reached them from the Avon, they should be worried about rain in Swindon, really. It's not the rain in Bath that's causing the problem. It's the rain over Wiltshire that's accumulating as gravity pulls it down towards the sea. That's what should worry them. So they should probably, as Hannah quite right said, they should try to have some agreement with some farmers in Wiltshire that they compensate.
Right,
I don't think they do. I don't think
no,
they do.
but you're saying that you should be.
You should know where it comes from.
Prepared to make sacrifices of fields and stuff, or something
that would be
have arrangements.
If it can be done, yeah. I mean, that would be one way of doing it. But you have to know where the water comes from. You know, the big river, the River Thames in London doesn't come from London. It comes from Swindon. It starts in Swindon, and then eventually but the water will be from. A huge area before.
But you have river gauges everywhere. So is the information there for Bath or for London or for Oxford? I mean, it goes through Oxford, obviously, the Thames.
Yeah, I think Hannah would know more about
it. Is it all under control?
Is it under control? we have some information on the rivers, so that's good. We need more. So it's really difficult to get the money to maintain some of these river measurements. They're quite expensive and they need a lot of money to look after them. We don't have enough. But one thing is, you're just talking about the river like it's like a little snake that kind of goes down like this. But you have to think about the whole landscape as the river. Because when the rain falls on the land, it's soaking into the landscape or running over the top. And that's all kind of part of the river too. So it can rain right up in the hills, and all of those little water droplets will end up in the river. So you have to understand that they're part of that river system. And it's really easy to think about the river and the water coming through Bath, is just the river. But it's not. It's what's fallen in the hills. It's maybe what's flushed out of somebody's toilet. All of that is part of the river.
You just remind what is it with the toilets?
It's very easy to forget about that part of thing and talk about the natural landscape and how much rainfall's changing, what's flowing down the rivers. But we're using a lot of water. We use water to water our crops. My son uses a lot of water to shower with for about 20 minutes so he can do his hair in the morning. So our water use is humongous, and we really need to think about cutting down how much drinking water we're extracting to wash our hair with and things like that, or wash our clothes with, wash our cars with, maybe just leak all over the road if you happen to be a water company nearby. That's not good enough, because that's contributing to the flood problem, but it's also contributing to our risk from drought, from running out of water, that water security problem. We just kind of use it. We just think it's just going to keep coming, this clean water system. But that's not true either.
I wanted to talk to you, Thomas. You've done this study on the Chew Valley flood, which I hadn't even heard of.
Right. The study of the Chew Valley.
Well, I know the Chew Valley, and I know of your study, but I didn't know that there's
forgiven.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if in any sense it sort of addresses what we're talking about. This is just close to between Bath and Bristol, I guess.
Yeah, so it's a pretty little river that runs north-south in Somerset. It does in some ways, because it's in a hydrological sense, it's actually quite a boring place. It's got a fairly big dam reservoir that's sort of back up to supply Bristol and that part of the world. So not much really happens from year to year. But one year, had this rip-roaring flash flood event in the middle of summer, which is very unusual for this part of the world, which was about 8 to 10 times bigger than you would normally see, sort of tearing the village apart, bridges, houses, everything. And then that was in the late 60s, and since then we have seen nothing. So it's sort of, and prior to that, there's really very little evidence of anything as well. So they sort of, I think it talks to how difficult it is to prepare yourself for this. You should be telling people that every year you roll a dice and you see if you get flooded or not. But it can be so unlikely sometimes. But
so there was no one there would have expected this. They thought this is.
I don't think anybody would have seen anything like this at all. And it's a fairly steep part of the world as well. Very intense rainfall. So it starts at 11 at night, and it's 5 in the morning. It's over, and everybody's sort of wondering what just happened. What just happened?
And it's basically, as it were, a cloud parked in the right place for
I think a cloud parked across the western sort of last sway of the country, but I think this is where the epicenter.
So I mean, that's critical. There's a good example. There's other ones. I mean, we had the Boscastle flood as well. Yeah. So sometimes you get these really freak events, and that was a good example in the 1960s, where the rainfall. It's not just how intense the event is, but how it moves. So if it stays over one place for a very long period of time, which in the case of the Boscastle flood, there was a band of rainfall, and it just happened to move in exactly the direction that the band lay. So if you were in Boscastle, it just kept raining and raining and raining and raining and raining and raining, and that happens. But there's an extreme example of flooding in just that case, and the case with the Chew Valley. So I guess we need to be prepared for these sort of things. So I guess certain river systems will be more prone to this than others. But I guess that is a good example where something very extreme has happened in the past. There was no influence of climate change on that event. Nobody could have said that flood was climate change, because there was nothing to do with that. And yet that was one of the extreme events in the record, and we have other examples like that. So it's difficult then to put the perspective of climate change in the context of these. And I think what's important for people to understand is that there is kind of this slow underlying trend in the climate, which means that the likelihood of these is increasing. That doesn't mean that you're going to get a rainfall event last year or this year or next year necessarily. And just because you haven't had one for a few years doesn't mean you're not going to get one. But the likelihood is that with time you will much more likely to see an event. And when you do, it'll be more intense. So we shouldn't be surprised if we get more events like that.
Right, that was going to be my question. So it's slightly tipping the dice, as it were.
Rolling the dice. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it might be Chew Valley that year, Tenbury 2 years running here.
Yeah.
And across Europe, in a sense, your expectation would be, let's say, across Europe, if you give a big enough area.
Absolutely. Then I don't know if we can bring up that graph actually, because I think that really demonstrates it.
This is the one.
This is the one. Can I just explain this to people?
Yeah, do.
Okay, so this is showing us from 1980 right up to 2080. This is a 100-year record.
Is this the line?
And you can see,
Yeah.
oh, that's better, yeah. The white line is the underlying trend. So what is plotted here is just the number of very heavy rainfall events across the UK each year going through time to 1980. And you can see the white line is kind of this average behaviour that we expect, gradual increase. But then the orange line is perhaps what we might see, because we're only ever going to see one actual realisation of what climate change looks like. And if you followed along that orange line, it bumbles about. And then you can see at about 2044, there's this massive peak, and then it drops down again. And basically what happens is that, if you were there at that time, you would have had no inkling that that was coming. But there we have a sudden year where all of a sudden we've got a huge number of very extreme rainfall events across the UK. And the reason you get features like that in the data is because just at that point everything has come together. So you've got lots of modes of variability in the climate. It's hugely complex, but you've got this underlying trend, which is the climate signal, and then all of a sudden it comes together. And I like to liken this to standing on a beach in an incoming tide. So if you're standing on a beach with your sandcastle, the tide doesn't just slowly creep up and knock your sandcastle down. Actually what happens is that the waves come in lulls, and then there's a sudden one and it knocks over your sandcastle, and then it goes back again. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. So there's lots of different modes of variability, and I liken the climate change signal to the incoming tide, this irrevocable incoming tide, but actually what you see on the ground is what happens to your sandcastle on the beach. So whether it's knocked over or not is a combination of factors. And actually what is the last thing, and I'll stop so other people can talk, but the range here in the kind of orange shading is what we need to be prepared for, because that is what range we could expect from these. This is state of the art, this is the best simulations we have at the moment, and that is what we need to be prepared for through time. And you can see the envelope is gradually changing and reaching more extreme and spanning out, and that's what we need to be prepared for, because any of those could be possible through time.
So in that 2044 simulation, as it were, it might be that it was an El Nino and lots of people talk about the jet stream nowadays.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
happened to be right. There's a bit of warm patch in the Atlantic, and it all happened at the same time.
So
and that would
lots
give
of
you
factors come together, exactly. So that's right. So there's lots of things going on. So there's obviously climate change. There's changes in Arctic sea ice. So around this time, we'll move to an ice-free Arctic, and that has influences on our weather patterns as well. So there may be some sort of forced changes, but basically there's various modes. The North Atlantic Oscillation is a critical one, controlling the jet stream and our climate and what we see here. And these can come together with kind of boost the climate change signal.
I guess we're not actually on there, but
no, we're back down here. But we're moving into the position now where changes are emerging in the data set. So we see this already. So this is obviously model projections. So this is what a model thinks, and
it's
this
not
is
a forecast for 2044.
This is the weather forecast model run for 100 years.
Yeah.
So this took several months to run on the supercomputer at the Met Office to run each of these, and there's 12 runs in here. And we've just shown you what they're projecting. This is the result it gives us. So it's like a weather forecast run out for 100 years.
Yeah, what I'm sort of wondering is if we had a year like the one you've got there on 2044, is that a year when we'd look back and say, blimey, I wish it was dry like it was back in 2024?
Well,
I mean,
the norm is changing.
Because you've got 90, is it, they're extreme events.
Yeah. So the norm, I think that's the thing, the norm is changing. So what we see as the norm in our weather patterns now is going to be different. But that time period is not very long away. That's only 10, 20 years. And climate change has been happening, but we're only really starting to see the effects now, especially for these sort of local flood events, which are so important for what we've been talking about.
Yeah. I mean, Hannah, to me this is such a thing in global warming is that most days I'm very happy with the weather. It's maybe like a bit less sun, a bit less rain, or a bit more sun or something. But it's that someone somewhere is more likely to get hit by something really quite disruptive, terrible.
Well, my parents tell me all the time. They say, well, it's really cold. So what's going on with global warming? I mean, it's impossible to try and think like that. So you do have to kind of imagine you're in a different place, experiencing a different thing. And that role of imagination is really important in trying to understand climate change, trying to understand what these futures might actually be like, that some days it's going to be really, really bad, but you're of course still going to get sunny days. They're not, they're not going to go away. In fact, they might really be quite hot as well. So, there's other things happening here as well as just rainfall. We've got all of those problems. Perhaps we're going to have really dry summers as well, which means, problems with drought and water security. So again, please fill up your water butts, capture that water where you can on your houses, maybe even on your roofs, and reuse that water where you can, because it's really precious. And yes, it might fall all in one go and flood us, but we're going to have other problems too.
I mean, the engineering issue is that it's expensive to anticipate for these things, and it sounds like we need, if Lucy's right, to think a lot about the kind of infrastructure we have, but not to do that is going to mean a lot more Tenberries, I guess. So it's still expensive.
I guess so. I mean, this is very, it looks like doom and gloom, but I think there's also opportunities in here if we realise. So we talk about heat, for instance, and warm cities is going to be a perhaps be a problem, and so maybe we can come up with some solutions that are, could work on flooding, but it can also address issues of increasing heat. Maybe they can address issues of increasing or deteriorating air quality in our cities at the same time. So we might come up with a greener solution, or maybe this is a prompt for us to come up with greener solutions to things. And who doesn't like trees? I mean, there's also a human well-being aspect of that as well. So
and canals, in fact, right? Canals.
Who
doesn't love canals?
Who wants to
That's
rebuild
true,
the Wilson Barks?
Okay. Green and there's an opportunity for green and blue infrastructure rather than thinking about locks and weirs and culverts and the things we've talked about. It's maybe a new paradigm in how we live and
Have
how
you got
we
one in your
live.
back pocket? I mean, this is what you work on, isn't it?
Well, partly, yes,
Yeah.
it's part of it, yeah. And I don't think a green roof here or there is going to do much for flood risk in Bath, but there are many other. It will certainly help, and certainly further downstream. But there are many other benefits to it. So flooding is one issue we're going to be facing, but we're going to be facing a whole raft of other issues as well if the climate changes.
I promised then that, and I always promise myself I'm going to let people ask questions rather than me. I've been hogging the conversation. has this conversation stimulated anyone? I've got this microphone here for anyone to ask. Yeah, go on.
Hello there. So there's been a lot of discussion about how we can mitigate water flow and that. And I was just interested to know, because I know the government lately has been talking a lot about relaxing planning regulations, building houses in areas that they wouldn't otherwise have been. And I was wondering what recommendations, if any, the panel would make on those planning regulation changes, what we should change, what we shouldn't change, and how you think, how receptive the government has been to any recommendations you may have made as an academic.
Well, the government is not, particularly joined up on this matter, shall we say. So there is a push for housing at any cost. And then there is a whole other portion of government which is, we need to be really careful because people are going to get flooded if, we need to look after this. So some of it is we need to talk together and really come to some kind of agreement on this, because just like talking at completely cross purposes at the moment, and it's really dangerous. Because you're just storing up those problems. If we cut the sustainable drainage requirements and things like that on these new houses, and we put people in the way of floods by building on a floodplain, these are terrible ideas. So let's not do that.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Will we ever get to a point where there's the changes to our climate are irreversible? Where we can't stop them, put them back.
Yeah, okay, so that's something people are really worried about. I guess so irreversible changes are where we basically lock into a new mode and we can't return to where we are. So there's a number of possibilities about how that could happen. And some of these processes are not included in climate models. So one is around permafrost. So large parts of the world are frozen, and if they get as we warm up, they could release vast quantities of methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. So that could tip us. There are changes in ice. So if we lost a lot of our ice sheets, could we ever regain them? And changes in the patterns of the ocean. So there are real risks, and I think this is why there was a decision made to try and limit global warming to below 1.5, or if not 2, to try and avoid some of the potential risks of irreversibility. Because obviously if we then moved into a different mode, it would be such a very, very, very long time before we'd ever return. I'm sure the Earth as its whole will one day. I mean, we have been in a situation where we were completely iceball Earth many, many, many years ago. And the Earth does operate on very different timescales, but these are outside of human, existence. So we are trying, and I think it's really important. So I guess something like that, just to say this is not inevitable. This is a projection. This is based on us not reducing our emissions significantly. So this is kind of a fairly reasonably high-end pathway. This is not, so it shouldn't be seen as doom and gloom. It's not necessarily where we're going to go, but it will be where we go if we don't do something. So I guess the beauty is we do have the chance now to do something about it.
Which sort of brings me to the back to this expense thing, which is that, yes, you can build your way out possibly of these things, but there are other ways of avoiding the floods of the future. Thomas?
Well, yeah, I was just thinking about what Hannah said. I think, yes, being disjointed, but by no means. I don't think that's ever a good solution to anything. But there are obviously social and political pressures to build, and probably an economic argument for building as well. But it doesn't have to look the way it always done. I think maybe there are avenues for innovation in how, if we really, I mean, nobody should probably build in an active floodplain. I'm not advocating that at all, but they could bring flood resilience of homes and communities to the forefront. Better warnings, different construction materials, different ways of building.
We've seen these houses where you can actually just build them on stilts, right? And then they float up and down.
Exactly.
Like these actually exist, these houses, right?
Exactly.
People are living in these homes.
That's sort of a different way of thinking about the problem of living with it rather than trying to fight it at all times.
I think in Holland all the PowerPoints are sort of waist height or something, is that rather than...
Probably, yeah.
We put
Yes,
them down
don't
there
put
to
them-
get maximum damage if there is a flood.
Yeah. So embrace that this is the way nature works rather than trying to engineer or fight our way out of it. Because I think also when we do that, there'll be implications for biodiversity and for the wider environment. Of course, water voles don't have a vote. They don't wear placards, they just disappear. And when they're gone, you might forget they were ever there. And is that a price worth paying? I don't think so, but
Well, I feel we share this planet with about, I don't know how many other thousands, millions
Exactly. I
of
mean,
species.
if we try to engineer our landscape too much, I think I had an old colleague who said we'll end up with, if we keep engineering the landscape the way we do, we'll end up with pigeons, rats, cockroaches, and so, because these are the 4 species that can adapt to anything, whereas everything else will be disappeared. And you don't want to go there.
Hannah, cheer us up.
Please.
Well, I have an appeal to all of you, is that one of the things that you can do, which is to think really about water a bit more. So whenever you go out in the landscape and you see a puddle, or perhaps you're even crossing a river, or you see a cloud in the sky, I want you to think about that water that's there and think about where it might be going next. And every time you flush your toilet as well, think about that water. Where is it going to end up? Because the more we think about the water in our landscape, the more we can understand the importance of knowing what to do with it, and when there's too much and when there's not enough, and how we can actually change things to make that better.
Well, I think that's a very poetic way to finish.
Yeah,
Thank you so
very
much,
good point.
Hannah. Thank you, Hannah, Thomas, and Lizzie. Thank you very much. Thank you. Give them a round of applause, please.